Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to When We Have Conversations on Race. We're excited to be with you and to talk about this topic. We're going to get started today with a land acknowledgement. So we'd like to start off today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today, even though we are meeting in a virtual space. Healing Equity United is on the lands of Muwakma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territory lands. We would like to take a moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since before the US was formed as a nation. While the numbers vary, in 1492, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already living here. Today, there are 6.8 million Indigenous peoples in the US and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systemic destruction of their communities and culture. This continues through the present day. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present and consider how we are and can each in our own ways try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. And thank you. We'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the month of May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. In honoring the cultures and histories of the APA community this month, it's also important to acknowledge the ways in which white supremacy culture has used the APA community in times as a model minority, as an attempt to pit people of the global majority against one another, and at other times scapegoated during times of war, economic downturn, disease, etc. The rise in APA hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic is just one of the most recent spikes in violence and attempted erasure of the APA community. Between March 2020 and December 2021, a total of 10,905 hate crimes against APA identifying people were reported. Nearly 75% of APA women experienced racism, discrimination, and harassment in the last 12 months. To effectively disrupt the crisis of hate, we need to bring a broader understanding and awareness to the scope of the problem and to uplift the stories and experiences of the APA community. We hope that you will make space to have meaningful conversations with people in your network and consider the ways in which you can leverage your privilege to be in solidarity with the APA community this month and every month of the year.
So we would like to officially thank you from Healing Equity United. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and welcome to this space. We welcome into this space people of all genders. This may include those who identify as women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent. Those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We welcome the languages that might be spoken here amongst all of us: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds. It's working class, middle class, owning class, and those of us who aren't sure where we fit on the class spectrum. We welcome people who currently struggle to get access to the resources necessary for survival, like healthcare, adequate housing, reliable transportation, childcare, etc., and people who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible. We welcome people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you experience yours. That might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome those who identify as activists and those who don't. We welcome the single, the married, partnered, dating, those in monogamous relationships, or those in polyamorous relationships. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not. We welcome people in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome your emotions, joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome those who support your ability to be with us and join us here today. That might be your families, genetic and otherwise. We welcome people of different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. We welcome our elders, those who are in this space with us in our lives, and those who have passed away. Finally, we welcome those who have been to workshops like these in the past and those who have not. So welcome, most sincerely welcome. So we'd like to take a couple of moments to introduce ourselves. My name is Fiona Oliphant, and instead of boring you with my resume, I'll just share with some of the identities that I come into this space with and that have propelled me to do this work. So you'll see two flags. I'm a Jamaican American. My family includes those who are completely undocumented to those who are naturalized citizens. And so the impact of the oppression that immigrants face, particularly those without documentation, is a really tangible experience for me and something we had to navigate every day. Having said that, I am a US citizen and there's power and privilege in that identity. And the question is, how do I leverage that identity to be in solidarity with immigrants? I'm an attorney barred in New York and DC, and I have to acknowledge the power and privilege that my ability to put ESQ behind my last name gives me in certain spaces. I'm from the South Bronx, a community in New York City. It's primarily Black and brown, higher rates of crime, drug use, and poverty, but also higher rates of love and support helped to mold me into who I am today. And finally, the picture to the left is of my family. I'm married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. And we talk about the fact that he's never assumed to be other, even though he has an immigrant identity. We talk about white male privilege and racism. We have 3 biracial children, half Black, half white, and my eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father.
Hey everyone, my name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll also share some of the identity markers that I come into the space with. I identify as second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial as I have a white father. I am native to New Jersey, though I call the city of Philadelphia home. That's where I went to grad school. I have my master's in education. I used to be a middle school science teacher, and so I identify as an educator through and through. I currently live in Seattle, Washington with my partner who's pictured there and our dog Otis. And I also wear the hat of an education director for a small nonprofit in Seattle called Seattle Works, where we facilitate learning and healing spaces for folks to learn about anti-racism and anti-oppression in the nonprofit sector.
Hi everyone, my name is Jess and I identify as a first generation immigrant who came to the US when I was 4 years old. My family, my parents were blue collar workers. They ran a steam cleaning business for restaurant kitchens. My mom, when she came here, was initially a seamstress. My dad, both my parents actually worked overnights, so I was a latchkey kid while I was growing up. My parents also didn't speak English, and so I identify as someone who is a perpetual interpreter and translator for both my parents. It's a role that I still play to this day. And I have pictured here my partner, who is a community organizer in Oakland, Chinatown, and our 2 dogs, one of whom is my service animal. So you'll see him, he travels with me on the planes. He's gotten much better about it over the years. His name is Hanson. And then our pandemic puppy who deals with separation anxiety. And so I also identify as a dog mom. Wanted to also just very quickly tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United. So we are a women-founded, women-owned consulting firm that works specifically with nonprofit organizations. Fiona and I have a combined 35 plus years of experience in the nonprofit sector, primarily in direct service organizations, working with immigrant and refugee survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking. And we decided to come together and start this practice after we had been executive directors and board members of multiple organizations over the course of our career, and oftentimes not seeing ourselves reflected in leadership. And in addition to that, oftentimes not having people in nonprofit leadership who are reflective of the communities that they're working with. And so we came together to found Healing Equity United and found Cassie along the way. And our work is really about moving organizations forward to have that cultural change, because we do not believe that a checklist of what to do is going to end oppression in our organizations, but it really is about creating that change within our cultures, which includes how we show up to work, how we work with one another, the processes, how we make decisions, and all of that is really to create spaces of belonging, not just for the individuals we're working with in the community, but for our staff and our board members as well. And so today, what we're going to be talking about is the key elements that we need in order to foster a brave space for conversations about race, and to really understand the difference between calling in versus calling out and calling within.
So to ground us in our time together, we'd like to share some group agreements. So we think that it's really important in having these conversations that we all agree that there's no room for oppression Olympics in this space. And hopefully that is an agreement that you will take back to your organizations when having these conversations internally. From Healing Equity United's perspective, all oppression is tied. So all of our liberation is tied. It doesn't behoove me to try to one up either Jess or Cassie that a specific identity that I have is more oppressed and harmed than a specific identity that they might have. We want everybody to agree in this space that baseline oppression is bad, period, right? Be in a brave space. These conversations regarding race requires vulnerability and bravery. We can't guarantee a safe space. Actually, whenever these conversations are had, harm usually does come into the space, and the key is about identifying the harm, interrupting the harm, mitigating the harm, and then healing from the harm as best you can in that moment to move forward collectively. Hopefully there will be challenging moments in our time together, and there will be definitely whenever you have these conversations about race. We also ask that you practice engaged listening. We find that in society, particularly now, we don't really practice engaged listening. Rather, we listen to refute, to rebut, to argue, to shoot down somebody else's thoughts. And when we're having conversations about race, it's really important to sit, to listen, to process, and then engage. Focus on your own learning, and of course, take care of yourself. So we'd love to hear from you all. If you can put into the chat, what has your experience been when you have conversations about race? What typically happens? So we're going to read them out. There are lots of feelings. People are dismissive and want to argue about what's being said. Some folks get defensive. People get awkward, frustrated. There's a stigma to the conversation. There's often a silence, a hush descends over the room. We move quickly to another topic. There's a tendency to make women of color the spokesperson for everyone, and so they sometimes prefer to just stay quiet. People shut down, get too uncomfortable to share. There's a lot of white fragility that comes up into this space, a lot of questionable looks, right? Oh, folks say that folks of color in the global majority are too sensitive. They're asked what's wrong with them. Hurt feelings, denial that there's even a problem. People want to be acknowledged and praised for being a good person, not being a racist. There's someone who said people can feel brave and open when they feel encouraged and supported. Some folks say it has nothing to do with them. They get it in the abstract, but they really don't know what they can do about it. And then the last one is sort of a superficial understanding or false understanding that's presented in that way. Oh, we're getting some more. People shut down, turn off videos, stop engaging. Yes, thank you so much, y'all. So some of you mentioned it in the chat, like when we have these conversations, the one thing that often comes into this space that detrimentally impacts our ability to have these conversations in a transparent and honest way is white fragility. And so even though white fragility has been around for many moons, Robin DiAngelo wrote a book, quote unquote, coining the term, and she defines it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable for white folks, triggering a range of defensive moves. And these moves include an outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. So we often know that even though there is white fragility, what folks don't often or equally talk about is identity fragility, right? And identity fragility is a term that Jess and I came up with to specifically identify what happens with folks who have marginalized identities themselves and need to be in space where these conversations are being held. And so it's an emotional state in which stress over a privileged identity triggers defensiveness, and it shows up as anger or guilt. And so from our perspective, without us having our own process of self-awareness and exploration, it can lead to a natural threat response, which is the fight, flight, or freeze. So what should you expect when you're having these conversations and holding space to have these conversations? First of all, a wide range of emotions, and that is normal. And we think that you have to acknowledge the emotions that are going to come into the space and not shut them down, not to be overly intellectual and theoretical and say we have to remain impassionate and we have to maintain our objectivity. This stuff is emotional, right? So some of the emotions that can come in to the space are defensiveness, as we heard in the chat, denial, shame, sadness, ambivalence. Another one that can come into the space is grief, right? Grief over the person who I thought I was yesterday, I might not be when I really unpack what's going on for me, right? So grief over losing that person.
And so what we're going to be doing now is we just want to run a poll and see, for those of you with us, like how comfortable are you with talking about race and racism? So I'm going to launch a poll right now, and we're going to invite you to respond. And if you can't see the poll, it might be that you have too many windows open. So you might want to minimize some of those windows. It looks like about 50% of folks have responded so far. We're going to give you all a couple of extra seconds. So how comfortable are we today with talking about race and racism, whether it's with people in the same racial groups as us or with people who are in different, who identify in as a different racial group? Give it a few more seconds. Right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And what it looks like is that, and I can share the results with you all so you can see it. So what it looks like is that about 14% of us are very comfortable with talking about race and racism. A little over half of us are comfortable with it. And then there's about 30%, well, there's about 20% of us who are uncomfortable, and one person who isn't too sure. And that's great. Thank you so much for participating. And so why are we asking you about that, right? So I think one of the things to really be aware of is, in addition to some of the common emotions that show up for us and for others as they are discussing, as we're discussing race, it's also important for us to think about, like, how comfortable are we with being comfortable and or uncomfortable? And if we are comfortable with talking about race, is it with every single person out there? Or is it only with the specific segment of folks? So I know, for example, within the Asian American community, that I am very comfortable talking about race and racism with people whose values align with mine. But I can be very uncomfortable talking with someone in my community who has harbored a lot of anti-Blackness feelings. Be very uncomfortable for me to talk about those issues. I think it's important for us to do some of that internal work to recognize, like, what is coming up for us. And then secondly, I have another poll question that I want to ask you all. And it is, and you'll see it on the screen, like, how comfortable are you with showing vulnerability? So your own vulnerability. Give you all a couple of seconds, more seconds to respond to that. And then we're going to tell you why and what the connection is. Let's give you about 5 more seconds, and I'm going to end the poll, and then I can also share the results with you all. So based on the results, it looks like about 11% of us are very comfortable with showing vulnerability. Congratulations. We've done some deep work. About 46% are comfortable. About a third of us are uncomfortable. And a few of us are very uncomfortable. And thank you for just being, transparent and honest with us. And so why are we asking these questions? And it's really because when we're talking about race and racism, particularly whether it is interpersonal or in the workplace interpersonal, we have to be able to foster brave spaces. When we want to have impactful and productive conversations on race, we have to have these 4 different elements. One is that vulnerability. We know that it's not enough that we care about ending racism in our communities and hoping that others who care about us will also see the light because they care about us, right? It has to go beyond that. When we're talking about ending racism, we have to be able to make that interpersonal connection with the others so that we can see their humanity. The other thing is also about having a psychologically safe space in the workplace for having these conversations. What I know, having worked in white-led spaces, is that oftentimes when we want to talk about racism and feel safe doing so, the folks who identify as BIPOC are part of the global majority, and I might take a lunch break outside of the office to a restaurant that we know that our other white colleagues won't be at, in order to have that safety to talk about what we're experiencing, right? So the question is, do you have psychologically safe spaces at your organization, or do you have to create that? And do you have to create that by saying, folks who want to, have these conversations, these are going to be some of the agreements we're coming to. There's going to be no retaliation. It's optional for people to participate. We're going to provide a therapist on site. We're going to, it's kind of, if you think about an ERG in the corporate sector, right? Like, we're going to give you all some funding so that you can have lunch separate outside and not worry about any of this getting back to us. It also requires that we have that level of self-awareness in understanding how our own racial trauma shows up and how our own racial healing shows up and or not. And then also holding ourselves accountable for when harm is caused, or when we are the ones who might have caused harm. And knowing that all of us have caused harm at some point in our lives, right? And so how are we holding ourselves accountable for that? And so what we're going to do now is share with you all 3 different strategies that people typically engage in when race and racism come up in conversations. And the first one is what Fiona and I came up with, which is really thinking about calling within. So calling within is something that we believe you should do whether you're going to call in someone or call out someone. Calling within for us is a first step of having that deep awareness, understanding ourselves. Like, how often are we checking in with ourselves regarding our triggers, our biases, our experiences? Are we able to really actively listen without thinking about our responses in the moment? Are we able to accept feedback, whether we agree with it or not, accept the feedback that others are giving us? And in the process of accepting that feedback, are we able to then repeat back what we think we've heard and ask for that check to make sure that what we're receiving in terms of feedback is what they meant to share? How are we healing from past traumas that we've dealt with? And are we able to take responsibility for that and any future harms that might be created? And then really going back to what we shared earlier about having that in the workplace, which is, how are we holding ourselves accountable? And so we strongly believe that calling within is that breath that you take when someone says something, right? And we're triggered by it, right? Or when someone does something, or we read something in the news and we're triggered by it. It's like taking that second or two for ourselves to check in with ourselves, to ground ourselves before we take that reaction. It's the same reason for why some people are like, oh, you want to write a response back via email? Wait a second, hold off on that quick response, right? And so calling out is something that is more familiar with, I think, a lot of us, which is because it's been more popular. It's also been equatable to cancel culture. It's because it's a lot easier. It's a way of addressing socially problematic language and behavior. It's especially done online. And essentially, when we're calling someone out, we're issuing a direct challenge to something that they've said or done, usually in public, and with the intent of exposing the person's wrongdoing to others. So we're trying to expose them. But the question is, do they actually have to take action as a result of our calling out? So one thing about calling out is that it doesn't engage the other person in an empathetic dialogue. It's like what happens on Twitter, right? Typically, we call someone out on Twitter. Sometimes we cancel them. Maybe we won't buy products from their company anymore. Maybe we won't donate to their organization, right? But the question is, does it actually create an internal change within them? Or is their response like, oh, you didn't like what I said, I'll say it differently next time. Or maybe I won't say it, or I'll apologize, or I'll close our coffee shops around the country for an hour and we'll do a race training and everyone will know how to deal with racism, right? We know that that doesn't work. It's a very superficial way of addressing an issue. However, I do want to point out that calling out is something that is used in organizing sometimes, because it can be really powerful at drawing attention to a problematic behavior. Particularly, you think about your Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, right? Your Harvey Weinsteins, right? Thinking about, like, it is a way of calling people out who are high profile, and particularly in immediately dangerous situations. So thinking about it as like a whistleblower. So I'm going to pass it over to Fiona, who's going to talk a little bit more about the strategy that we usually recommend, which is calling in.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. And so we want to put this all into context, right? So you all joined our conversation because you're interested in having conversations on race. We know that these conversations often go sideways really quickly. It dissolves into or devolves into crying, screaming, people walking out, people turning off cameras, people getting all in their emotions. And what is that driving dynamic? One of the driving dynamics is that often when we think we're calling people in, we're actually not. We're actually judging, shaming, blaming folks. And so here are some pointers of maybe more effectively calling in. And when we practice this individually, we then begin to create that space that Jess was referring to in terms of fostering a brave space. When we practice calling in, we can start to model it within our teams, within our programs, within our organizations as a whole, with the goal being that we can have conversations about race and really listen to each other when we might have differing opinions, differing approaches, so that we can get to a mutual understanding. So what is calling in? It's an opportunity from our experience and our perspective for a more meaningful conversation and engagement across difference, right? It is an opportunity to maybe learn more and understand. It is when we help others to imagine different experiences and different possibilities or outcomes without believing that our experiences and perspectives are the only valid ones in the space. It is an opportunity to provide multiple perspectives and hopefully to shift paradigms, hopefully to shift your organizational or programmatic culture. The thing that we like to focus on calling in, and Jess mentioned this for calling within, right? It's that pause. Calling in is not reactionary. Calling in is reflective and strategic. Now, we often get questions about, well, what do you mean by that? And what does that look like? So there are a variety of different ways that we can call folks in. One very typical example is that you have a staff meeting. You have a staff meeting and it seems to some in the room, might seem to me, that folks of the global majority, staff of the global majority, aren't being called on in the staff meeting. Or when they say something and contribute something, it's being ignored or overlooked. And then a white colleague basically reiterates what was just shared, and all of a sudden it gets attention, or your white colleagues speak over your staff of the global majority. Calling in might look like in this situation to whoever's facilitating and holding the space. Dear Susie Q, excuse me, so I'm noting that there are members of our community who identify as folks of the global majority who aren't necessarily being heard in this space. And so if we could take a pause to intentionally integrate them into this conversation, that would be great. Now, that's not saying, Susie Q, you're racist because you're not calling on, X, Y, and Z. It's not saying, Susie Q, you run a horrible meeting and I'm going to storm out, right? It's saying, I'd like to note a dynamic and have that dynamic addressed. Let me give another example of calling in. Another example of calling in might not be to say anything to Susie Q in that space, right? But to pull Susie Q aside later and say, look, this is what I saw, and this is the impact that behavior has on folks. And during our next staff meeting, I think it would be really important for you to acknowledge that dynamic, hold space to address that dynamic, and collectively figure out how we're going to change that dynamic going forward, right? So those are two different examples of calling in. Some things that I'd like to really harp on. One, when you're calling another person in, first you have to determine whether or not you're in the space to call them in, right? If I'm the recipient of harm, if I do a quick assessment of where I am in that moment, I call within, I might not be the right person to call anybody in. I might be too angry, too activated, right, to call anybody in effectively, right? So it might be onto my colleagues to call others in that space. So do a quick assessment of whether or not you're the right person to call anybody in. Another thing to note about calling in is that you can't be responsible for how you're calling in is going to land on the recipient. That person might be defensive. That person might be angry. That's not on you, right? And as you all in an organization are starting to create that culture of having these conversations in a nuanced and respectful way, then others are going to hold that person accountable for their defensiveness. And you need to do your work, Susie Q, right? And the last thing I'll say about calling in is that calling in should not be mistaken for tone policing. When we say calling in, we're not asking anyone to dim their shine or hide their truth. When I'm talking about calling in, I'm talking about being very transparent about dynamics and situations and harm, but in a way that invites further conversation, right? Not about hiding or lying, or Fiona, you need to be less angry, or, any of that. So I will pause there. And Cassie, do we have any questions coming in?
Yeah, I'm not sure that everyone saw my message in the chat, so I will name this now. If you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A so that we can stack those questions and make sure that we address them as they come in. I did see maybe one or two people maybe raise their hands. So yes, if you do have that question, please put it into the Q&A, and we'll give a moment for those to roll in.
Thank you, Cassie. So how do we get better at doing this? So it's really important for us as individuals and then members of the community within our organizations to focus on calling within and calling in. in order to spur transformation and to have an enhanced impact on these discussions. You want to cultivate a space for trust. You want to shift your cultures. And so I would say, if you've tried to have these conversations internally before and they went sideways and a whole lot of harm was caused, don't think you can jump right into having those conversations tomorrow. First, you have to address the harm that was caused, right? You have to create some space for healing in order to start then cultivating that space for these conversations. Folks in leadership who have poor communication responses, check yourselves. Check yourselves, right? When somebody brings something to your attention in terms of, disparities or inequitable impact or harm that is coming into the space, tip, the appropriate response is, oh no, that's not happening. Oh no, maybe you're being too sensitive. Oh no, maybe you misunderstood. Wrong answer. Wrong answer, right? Also, if your response is to yell, scream, shut folks down, say that's not you or that's not your organization, again, wrong answer. You're then displaying elements of defensiveness. And you're not going to have a culture in which people are going to have these open and honest conversations internally. Jess, do you have an example you'd like to share?
Yeah, so one example of when I call, I have many examples, but this is the one that I will share with you all. So one example of when I called in someone. So I used to be an executive director of a transitional housing nonprofit in the Bay Area. And when I came in, the organization was not serving any immigrants. And when I spoke with the founder who I basically succeeded, we had this conversation because she was still a big part of the organization. Yeah, she had founded this organization, been part of it for 40 years and had a lot of ties to our donors and our funders and very well respected in the Bay Area. And I had a conversation with her where I asked her, I was like, well, how come we're not providing housing, transitional housing for trafficking survivors who are immigrants? And her response to me, and I'll never forget it because it had that personal impact on me. Her response to me was, well, how are you going to serve them if they don't speak English? And all immigrants eventually go home. And the way that I called her in was like, I said, well, when you said that to me, when I heard you say, just checking for accuracy, when I heard you say that all immigrants go home and how do we serve them when they don't speak English? It hurts me because I'm an immigrant and I identify as an immigrant and I identify as someone who took ESL classes when I was a kid. And so what does it mean to you if I were the person who had to come and get services? And I don't intend on leaving because I'm now a US citizen. And so it was really about, making that personal connection with her, where at that point she was like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And it turned out that she had a specific perception of who immigrants were in this country. And then, of course, we talked about, solutions to that. But, if I hadn't if I hadn't taken that pause of calling within to understand for myself, like, I'm not the one who's being attacked. I may be triggered by what she said, which is really why I still remember what she said to this day. If I hadn't taken that pause for a moment, I probably would have responded by saying something that was maybe along the lines of calling her out and would not have been productive for what I was trying to do, which was essentially open our door to immigrants. And so I think that's an example that I had that I wanted to share. So Cassie, I do see that we have some questions. And yeah, let's start with some of the questions then.
Yeah, so the first one that came in There's often emphasis on how to do calling in and calling out, but how do we practice being called in and called out and not let our emotions take over and be calm in people's reactions to call in?
Yes, I can start with that since I just kind of shared an example where I had to do that. So for me, over the years, I've worked really hard on mindfulness because I tend to, just being a survivor of violence and having experienced a lot of racial trauma over the course of my life, I acknowledge that sometimes I am more quick to feel threatened and more quick to want to either fight, flight, or freeze in that moment. And so for me, it's when someone says something and I can already feel my emotions taking over because I've worked on some body work, I either take a pause. I also have an emergency response toolkit where when I'm triggered, I have certain things that I do, which is take a couple of deep breaths. Maybe I'll just say, hold on, I actually have to send out an email or I have to answer this text and let me come back to this conversation. So making an excuse so that I can take a walk around the block or go to the bathroom if I'm at work and just take a couple of deep pauses, right? So that I can have a productive conversation and be calm when I'm calling that person in later. Fiona and Cassie, what do you two do?
I guess I'll go first, and then you can jump in, Kathy. So, my practice has not happened overnight. It is continuously evolving, and that's over years. And one is to be open. First, like to sincerely be open to your team about, I need feedback. And I welcome the feedback. And sometimes it might be harsh, and sometimes it might be shared in a way that makes me cringe. But to really be sincere in requesting the feedback so that folks can see that you're modeling this behavior, and that they can practice the calling in on their own behalves, right? And so that when you have to call someone in, it's not just a one-way street. It's that, Fiona is also asking to be called in as well. It's everything, ditto what Jess said, taking a breath, taking a pause, moving away. And I will also say that it gets easier when we make these spaces regularly occurring. When these spaces are created in reaction to a harm, and they're just once in a blue moon, and it's filled with these very activated emotions, it's far more challenging to have that nuanced conversation in space. Cassie?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that often when we're called in and we have the negative feelings that might come up, that's often a knee-jerk reaction to how the feedback that we're receiving might be misaligned with our own perceptions of who we are, right? And our egos might feel that kind of bruise. And so just to be mindful of that, and also to be mindful of the potential biases that you might be coming into this conversation with. That's something that I've been trying hard to think about when I'm having these conversations around calling in and calling out. Next question. What are your thoughts on cancel culture, and how, if at all, does it impact conversations on race?
I go first quickly. So look, I think that cancel culture has instilled a lot of fear in people. Like, if I have this conversation and then I say something that people deem as bad, then I'm going to be canceled, right? And we don't have time for people to live in fear right now. Like, what we typically say at Healing Equity United in our group agreements when we're holding these spaces is we give people permission to say it messy, not harmful, but say it messy. And if it is harmful, then we're going to call you in. But we create judgment-free shame-free spaces for folks to share their thoughts, right? To say it messy. But yeah, cancel culture is real, and many of us have been on the receiving end of that. But yeah, I'll put it there. What about for you all?
Yeah, I think about cancel culture being something that it doesn't shift the culture, right, of how people are. And so the question for that is like, okay, so we might have canceled the Weinstein Company, right? The Weinstein Company. We might have canceled. We tried to cancel Starbucks, right? When all these things came out about the police and being called on a couple of Black folks in Philly, but Starbucks is still here, right? All they did was like respond to it by saying, hey, we're going to close our stores for an hour on this Wednesday, and we're going to teach everyone about race and racism. And did it change anything? I don't think so, because I believe what was it, a few weeks after that they issued something saying that if you want to talk about race, you could talk to like almost any employee at the Starbucks store, including BIPOC folks, right? Like that didn't shift or change anything. And so my question is like, cancel culture works well when you're trying to cancel one individual sometimes, and because they're causing significant harm, but it doesn't actually shift the culture. So if you're going to cancel them, I think you have to combine that with some calling in of folks within the organization so that you're shifting culture.
Thank you both. Moving on to the next question. What if the organization or group continues to display defensiveness and or blame on a person who is calling in out within? What are solutions for the person other than removing themselves from the group or organization?
We were just talking about this yesterday. So look, I'm going to be honest. Life is short. Life is short. So personally, I'm going to give you this much of my energy and my support and efforts to help shift the culture and to call you in and to give you access to resources and to, model the behavior that I would like to see throughout the organization. But, at some point, I have to do my own assessment as to how much harm that I can psychologically and emotionally withstand. And when I have determined that I have hit that point, then it's time for me to leave and go find organizations and spaces that are more aligned with my approach, right? And so I know that that is not a perfect answer. I know I don't give you a timeline of what you can do, but first it starts with the internal. How much am I willing or able to give in this space? How much support and resources can I do to prompt change? But we also have to let folks know that we have power, and collectively we have a whole heck of a lot of power. And so folks should not feel trapped and beholden to spaces that don't want us, aren't created for us, and when I say us, I mean anybody who wants to promote equity and wants to promote belonging, right? I'm not talking about a specific group. So we don't have to be beholden to those spaces and those organizations. So yeah, that would be my response.
Thanks, Fiona. The next question, is calling in designed to change behavior or relieve the stress of the person offended? Because if a person is racist, calling in can be futile.
Jess, do you want to answer that first?
Why don't
or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So look, I've said this many times in other spaces. In my personal practice, I don't know if I'm able to call in a KKK member right? Like that's just where I am in my personal journey. Am I short of that? Am I able to call in folks who don't understand how their behavior is tied to systemic racism? I can have those conversations. Um, am I able to call in folks who may change one behavior that harmed me yesterday to replace it with another behavior that's going to harm me tomorrow? I'll take a deep breath and have those conversations. But I think that what we do in our practice is talk about the universal nature of systemic oppression and racism being one form of oppression. And folks feel a lot more comfortable in having these conversations when they know that when I say we need to have a conversation about race and racism, you're not calling me a bad and evil person. You're simply pointing out how an entire system is showing up in my behavior. And in fact, in most of our behaviors, right? And so it sort of takes a lot of that stress and emotional burden off. Jess?
Yeah, so I'm gonna actually pass it over to Cassie. If you didn't get a chance to have your questions answered, I wanted to make sure that you had our contact information, so you can always contact us with any other questions that you might have. And I'll turn it over to Cassie now.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. We just wanted to give a moment for you all to provide some feedback in terms of how this webinar was for you. And so I dropped a link for a quick SurveyMonkey evaluation just to give us some feedback so that we can continually improve these free webinars for folks. And also just wanted to plug some of the next opportunities that we have to engage with Healing Equity United. We have our next free webinar around embracing an anti-racist culture on nonprofit boards. And Jess is dropping that link into the chat. Actually, I will drop that into the chat for everyone to view. And then we will also be having one on around APA Heritage Month and how to move away from Stop Asian Hate to uniting for racial solidarity as well. And so, yeah, with that, we just want to thank everyone for participating today, for joining us, and for having these conversations. And as Jess mentioned, our contact information is up here. We would love to hear from you all. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.